Yeah, I mean, I think for those of you who don't know, Arjun, I think it's kind of a crypto myth that Arjun coined the term chain abstraction. I don't know if he's going to admit it to us today, but at least that's how I have it in my books. So I'm curious, kind of from your perspective, seeing this vision from several years back. Let's kind of just do a quick run through of what's been accomplished over the last couple of years, and kind of how your vision in the earliest days of seeing this abstracted crushing experience has kind of come to fruition now. And then I'd love to kind of get into where we're going.
Sure, yeah. I mean, look, this is not necessarily rocket science, right? Like, for any product person in the room, like obviously we need to develop an experience where users don't have to understand the technology in order to use an app, right? Like imagine if you had to understand how YouTube works in order to look up a cat video. It would be insane. You would never actually ever use the application, right? Like that's not how the internet works today, and it's not that way for a reason. It was actually how the internet worked before the 90s, right? Before the 90s, in order to go and connect to something on the internet, you had to use Telnet, which was like an SSH protocol. You had to manually go and connect to somebody else's network, kind of like connecting to another blockchain, and then go and retrieve files from there, bring it back to your own home network to be able to look at files. It was kind of an insane experience. There was really only like less than 100 like actual servers that you could go and like collect stuff from at the time, because the internet was tiny and it was really just like universities and governments running it. And it wasn't until we created until really the World Wide Web was created. So basically the creation of HTTP, the protocol, where you had this abstraction layer that kind of sat on top of anything that created the web, right? And all of a sudden you went from this world where you had to be this really technical person typing code into a command prompt window, to now being able to go to a browser and going to a URL. And when you go to that URL, the URL serves you the content that you want to see. When that happened, I mean, that was the internet's literally the internet's Netscape moment. When that happened, the internet went from being like, just this teeny tiny thing to suddenly being like tens of thousands of websites, effectively overnight. I think we are basically right there right now, right? We have this very manual process to interact with chains because we all need to know chains. Everybody's very tribal about chains right now, but like, even if we all care about that, no one else does. Right? No one outside of crypto really gives a shit about what chain you're on. And I think that was kind of what we started thinking about years ago, but really started to look at about a year ago, where we realized, as an organization, we kind of realized we don't really have a market. We were trying to build like interoperability stuff. We were going and talking to applications, being like, "Hey, why are you building on only this chain?" They're like, "Well, we're gonna go." Like we talked to a DeFi application, for instance. I'm not gonna name, but they were deployed on Optimism and they were interested in deploying to other chains. And we were like, well, why are you doing this? Why go and copy pasta your application to every chain? Why don't you just like make it easy for users to onboard to your application from anywhere and have all of your liquidity consolidated on one chain? And they were like, well, because that's not what everybody's doing. And because like that concept was just completely foreign. And because we sort of said, well, you could abstract away the entire chain experience so your users can just use this. And they were like, well, it feels like there's a lot of work involved in doing that. And they were right? There's like so many different pieces of this puzzle associated with chain abstraction that comes from things like removing the need to think about RPCs, removing the need to like have to switch chains in your wallet, right? It's a coordination effort that involves a lot of different players in the space. And that was when we kind of got a little disheartened, because we were like, well, this doesn't seem like a problem we can solve. And I think we were right. Like we were able to solve like very small piece of that problem, but that was it. And so we had this idea, which was like kind of a Hail Mary. I don't think anyone really expected it to work. We were just like, well, why don't we just like create a meme? Why don't we just talk about this idea that you could create an application experience where users just never need to know what chain they're on? We created a GIF of like a demo of what it could look like, and we announced it as a product. We announced it as like, here is a chain abstraction toolkit. It lets you do this thing. And then in the like subtext below, we're like, we don't actually let you do all of these things. We let you do some parts of this, but eventually this is the user experience you can create. And I think that it ended up like inspiring a lot of people like that. We didn't really know what to expect, but that tweet ended up just getting like picked up and ran with, because a ton of other projects were like, yeah, you're right. This is the experience we need. And now we have like an entire ecosystem that has been built around this idea of like, okay, like permissioning level chain abstraction, things like particle network. or like sockets like Magic Spend plus plus or like one balance, right? Allowing for you to have a single balance, unified balance across all chains. That's something that like we were like, yeah, it would be really cool to do this. We had no idea how to do it. Now there are projects actually building this, and in fact, they are very, very close to going live, which is crazy. And then similarly, going through the whole stack, things like intent protocols, something that we were doing in the past, like the solvers of those intent protocols, like there's a growing ecosystem of people that are actually like providing the services to make this happen. And then lastly, Everclear, what we're building, which is like the kind of backend mechanism to make it possible for solvers to be able to do all of this in the first place. Yeah, memes are powerful, right? Memes are like honestly the only thing that we've seen consistently have value, both inside and outside of the space, like Bitcoin, the US dollar. These are all just memes. And so, yeah, there's something interesting to be said about just like, coming together and this like having this Schelling point, that this like North Star for what should we be building in this space.
Yeah, I think one of the most appealing things to the next generation of people that come on chain is the lack of tribalism. I put out a tweet that was like, I think it was yesterday after kind of speaking to a couple of builders in the space about this alignment problem that we have in crypto. And the tweet was basically like, we need to get rid of alignment in crypto. The only alignment is building things that people want. And I do believe that the chain abstraction space is a narrative for now, but it's a principle of the way that we should be thinking about building products in the space. And I do think there's a lot of like ideological ramifications of building in this era of kind of chains not being the centerpiece, right? Whether it's from a valuation perspective for applications, whether it's from how users are going to interact. I think that there's these ramifications that we're starting to kind of get towards. And I'm curious from your perspective, how you see the kind of chain abstracted era, how that shift happens and what that change actually looks like. Because I think there's a big concern or pushback about chain abstraction right now, outside of the ideological stuff. It doesn't feel that like real, like tangible. Like I still use Rabby, I still have to bridge. Like it's not here, but we're getting close. But like, what is going to make this shift happen, and what are some of the ramifications of this for us who are in the space on chain already, as well as people who are coming in?
Yeah. Alignment is a really interesting thing. It's interesting because we have like bags. And like people want to pump those bags. But can you imagine if like your friends were like, no, 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 don't use this social app. It's not Amazon aligned. It's not like Google Cloud aligned. It's ridiculous, right? That's not how people use applications today. I think this shift is actually already happening, and it's going to continue happening. And the thing that's driving it is just the idea that like applications want to own their own stack. Like more and more apps today, look at the big chains. Even Arbitrum as like arguably one of the most, or if not the most successful EVM compatible general purpose chain out there today. The biggest winners on Arbitrum are going and building Arbitrum L3s. They're leaving Arbitrum 1. And this is going to keep happening. Every major application on every major chain is going to be like, yeah, why would I just stay here on this like general purpose thing instead of going and owning my own stack? Because when you own your own stack, you capture sequencer fees, you have ultimate customizability on like user experience and things like that, and you also avoid the like noisy neighbor problem of like someone else built a Ponzi scheme on this chain, and so the entire chain went down, and so my app went down as well. Like that's kind of insane, right? And so I think like it stands to reason that like every application is just gonna kind of want that and to become their own chain, especially if it's like easy enough. The question is, how do you make it easy enough? And I think chain abstraction is the answer to that, right? It's like the reason it hasn't happened yet is because it's just too difficult to onboard users from a bunch of other ecosystems. But it's ultimately just like a really traditional business problem. It's just like customer acquisition cost versus LTV, right? How much value are you getting out of your customer versus the cost of acquiring them? And like right now, the cost of acquiring customers across chains is far, far higher than the value you get out of them, because you have to like get them to bridge and things like that. So then it's easier to go and deploy to another chain rather than just get them to come to you. But with chain abstraction, like, across, for instance, right? You're onboarding users in like seconds, and they're paying almost nothing to get to your chain. Or to get to your app, and like you can bundle these things together with the actual app and like interaction itself. So you could do something like bridge and deposit into Aave on Aave chain as a part of a single transaction where the user doesn't ever need to know it even happened, right? When you get to that point, like the customer acquisition cost from another chain goes to zero, right? And at that point, it's like far more valuable as a product to be like, I'm going to put like as Aave to be like, I'm going to keep all of my liquidity in one place rather than I'm going to go deploy to like 15 chains and like, fragment my liquidity everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a big believer and proponent of the kind of general app chain thesis as well for the reasons that you laid out. I actually put a post out kind of saying that builders have a couple of choices right now. It's Solana or general purpose L2 or launch your app chain. I think we're still a little bit away from actually launching an app chain to be the best option, but I think that we're very close. I think right now, like the composability still has a little bit of work left, which is kind of like where I think I want to take this next one. We put out this market map. It was all this stack of the chain abstraction, kind of stack players, intents, orchestration, solvers. It's through my conversations with teams, it's been this collaborative effort, right? It's been this idea that there's going to be some wall abstraction happening. There's going to be sort of like a blockchain level abstraction or like bridge infrastructure, solvers, clearing. There's this kind of stack that needs to be built and that is being built. So how can we kind of align our missions as different teams within this stack to build for a single vision? Like, what is the vision that we are building towards as teams in this room, as people, as users? Like, what are we building towards? What's the end game for this chain abstraction stack?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think like we kind of talked about like the chain abstraction vision, right? And I think that that's actually been like there's a lot of times people ask like in what ways is both like chain abstraction different than everything that happened with like bridging traditionally, and then also just in what ways why is it so much less hostile? Because the bridging space is just like ultra competitive for no reason at all. There's enough market there for everybody. But it didn't end up happening. And I think the reason was that we didn't preemptively define like the goals, the outcome that we wanted to head towards. And we also didn't really define like what are the different problems to solve. And I think that's something that's actually happened in a much more natural, organic, positive sum way with chain abstraction, where everyone's been like, okay, instead of trying to focus on every single user, instead of trying to focus on every single problem, each project is focusing on one very specific problem. And so then if you're competing against other people that are like focusing on the same problem as you. And like, it's easier to form standards. It's easier to like share resources. It's like you're not necessarily in like as hostile of competition where you're like, okay, this person is just trying to monopolize everything or whatever, right? And I think what that's and you can kind of see this effect. Like there's been much better discussions around chain abstraction between these different projects. Like the fact that like all of these organizations are all like co-hosting this event with a bunch of other organizations that are in chain abstraction, right? And you're also seeing standards coming out of it, right? Like a cross and Uniswap standard around having like a generalized interface for solvers, enormously helpful. It's helpful for every single intent protocol, and like it's helpful because like everyone is like, okay, yeah, I could try to monopolize, but doing that would mean that I might end up shooting myself in the foot later.
So if you could kind of illuminate a bit more on some of the goals. You mentioned that the interoperability side kind of lacked these coordinated goals. What are some of the coordinated goals for the chain abstraction space over the next couple of years? I know I'm just throwing you on the spot here, but well, I'm super curious.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the core kind of vision, and I think Tabasco from Particle has actually written some really awesome articles on this if you want to check it out. But I guess the way that I think about the core vision and describe it at least succinctly is like, in a chain abstracted world, users should never need to care what chain they're on. Like obviously they should be able to know, right? You should be able to know what's happening under the hood if you want to, but you shouldn't have to care. And that, even though that seems really simple, that has some like really interesting implications, right? So one implication number one is like it has to work on every chain, because if it only works on some subset of chains, then you still have to care what chain you're on. It also needs to work in a way that's like cheap enough and performant enough, fast enough that like you can't really distinguish between the experience of interacting with an application that's on another chain versus interacting with it on the same chain, right? So like we're talking about like latency on the order of seconds, fees on the order of like bips. I think it also needs to be something that works all the time, right? So it's something where like you can't have a very small set of service providers that's making this happen. You can't have like you can't have these like network dynamics where like this is particularly what Everclear solves. Like you shouldn't end up in a world where there's like 2 or 3 market makers that are doing this for every single chain. That would be objectively very bad, because they're not going to do it for every chain. They're going to do it for the biggest chains, and then the longer tail chains just won't exist, right? You need it to be something that is decentralized because you need it to be resilient. You need it to exist even if some countries decide they're going to censor some solvers, or you need it to exist even if some solvers decide that they want to be malicious. You need it to exist even if people go down, because downtime is actually a thing that is like one of the biggest positives of decentralization is like 100% uptime. Like it's so extraordinarily difficult to deliver that even in Web 2. I mean, like you don't really think about this, but like think about the rare occasions where like something has gone down on the internet and how much it has broken the world. Like the like Windows thing and like um it just completely broke the world. And like you can't have that. Like if you want every financial system to rely on this infrastructure, it can never go down.
I want to give the audience a chance to ask a question. I have plenty more, but is there anybody that has a particular question for Arjun about chain abstraction? You can just raise a hand.
I'm curious, are there any specs that excite you the most amongst like in the space more than others?
Do you mean like specs of projects or more generally like how this stuff? Yeah. Yeah, this is a good question. I think we haven't necessarily done a great job of like specking all of this out because it's been something that's like evolving in real time. Uh, hmm. I guess like the standards are really the ones that are this like that are exciting for me, right? Those are specifications. They're specifications for like what everybody needs to adhere to, and I think that those are exciting because they basically they're like table stakes that everybody kind of has to like just puts down and everyone works around. And the more we can kind of create these like boundary conditions for how people are going to coordinate with each other, the better off we'll be. It's like it's a delicate game though, right? You don't want to be a central planner either. Like if you centrally plan this whole ecosystem, then you potentially end up making it really inefficient. And so I think what's happening is like there's actually been some debate about this about like the best way to let this evolve. But what's kind of happening is like projects are sort of like waiting to see how things coalesce and then defining the things that we kind of really understand. Like I really think that solver spec is like one of the best examples of this. I think standards around like tokens, I'm kind of biased here, but I think like EIP 7281, which is also known as XERC20, is like a really fantastic standard because it just provides a standard language for how tokens are minted and burned across chains that can be used by anybody, right? And like it just massively reduces the effort needed to do that activity as a bridge. But yeah, there is room to write these specs if you would like to help. I would love some help, and I'm sure we all would. Yeah, it's the across and swap one. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. So since we know that the cake model is very big and it has not many components, and one of the biggest problems that you're facing right now is communication between different layers of cake model, that is settlement, solver, and execution. And that's what everyone is trying to do. And even if we are building a dApp, let's suppose, we have to use multiple components to make it chain abstracted, not only in the EVM, but if they want to go into the Cosmos ecosystems or even in the Bitcoin L2 ecosystem, because major liquidity is coming from the Bitcoin. So my question is that how can we reduce the dependency on multiple protocols, and how can we increase the communication between different layers?
Yeah, it's a good question. So why do layers exist? Right? Why have layers? Layers in any so layered architecture is something that's been a part of computing systems for a very long time. They exist because to like separate concerns. So like each layer is solving one specific problem, right? TCP/IP, like TCP/IP is solving this specific problem of like how and where do you route packets on the internet. Then on top of that, you have TLS, which solves how do you secure those packets on the internet, right? So by separating out concerns and only solving one problem, you reduce the risk at any point in this stack. And in the case of what's happening with chain abstraction and also in this space, you also my mental model for how this stuff should work is like we should all define the problems, and then each layer should be its own kind of ecosystem of projects that are competing horizontally against one another as just like very like traditional competitors doing basically the same things and like just going to market in different ways. And then we just like strictly define the interfaces and the like the communication mechanisms between these layers. So to answer your question, I think the right, maybe it's just like a little bit of a continuation of the last answer, is like I think the right answer is like as these layers are getting to be more and more defined, and they really are, we are now getting to the point where we can then define like a standard interface between them. And then that way, it's like there can be like, 50 different intent protocols that are like receiving information from like particle and other like permissioning protocols, right? But ideally, those permissioning protocols are all like expressing that information in a standardized way, so that you don't have to have every intent protocol go and integrate every permissioning protocol, right? That's like where things get like messy and they don't end up working.
Only the last question I have, like, do you feel that chain abstraction is in the stage of OSI model right now, and it is to be converted into a TCP/IP model, and it's in the working?
I would not say it's like OSI specifically, only because OSI was very contrived. It was like very centrally. That was the downside of. So for context for everybody, when the internet was like first starting to be developed and starting to be designed, there was like two kind of models for how people were thinking about communicating with the internet. It was like TCP/IP, and then which is like what exists today, and then there was OSI, which is this like central, like basically governments put together this model that was like very very complex on like how, and that one didn't work out because it was just very like planned in a single room and without like user feedback or anything like that. I'm hoping that that's not what's happening right now with chain abstraction. It feels like it's not, because it feels like we have collectively tried to like keep our hands off of very strictly defining things until those definitions have kind of emerged a bit better. Right now, there are 4 problems to solve. There's there's like permissioning. How does a user give access to permission a solver to go and take money conditionally upon something happening? There is how do you find a solver? This is the intent protocol. There is solving itself, who actually fills the transaction, and then there is like settlement and rebalancing of the solver. So like how do you then make sure that solvers can continue? And like those are the 4 layers right now. If we find more problems, there would be more layers. If we find that some of those problems are not important, then some of those layers will just die.
Yeah, I find chain abstraction to be like inherently modular as a stack itself.
Yeah.
Also contributing to solving the biggest problem of Ethereum and of the modular kind of stack, which is the fragmentation of these chains. Just really briefly, we have like less than a minute. The current vision that I'm holding for chain abstraction is to be able within the next 12 months to interact on any L2 or L1 with a wallet interface that has balances across all of my chains, and I can just bookmark my apps that I use, Uniswap, Aave, I trade my Pudgy Penguins on Blur, and I just go to those apps. I don't connect my wallet. It just completely is abstracted. I can swap, bridge. I can do anything that I want just on those apps, building a much more application-centric user experience and much less requirements on bridging, on chain knowledge, and just that kind of general feel. And for me, being a Rabby user, Rabby kind of switches the chains now, which is super helpful. But you still have to bridge. You still have to think about where your assets are. And those 2 things for me right now are extremely, extremely annoying. And I know for the next generation of users, we want to onboard them to this kind of new and improved kind of user experience. So that's my current goal and vision for the space is like MVP. And I think if we can get there, we can do a lot more. So thank you guys for being out here, and give a round of applause to Arjun.
Thanks, everybody.